Hello everyone, so we have done reading our book Pollyanna, like I said in the last video, like a reading book. So we're moving on to Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, the first book of Harry Potter. Yes, and it's like about adventure when Harry learned in Hogwarts. Well, this is when Harry was really small, when he was like at a very small age. So let's read. Chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Private Drive were too proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you would expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbor. The Dursley had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursley had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they would bear that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was the Dursley sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursley-ish as it was impossible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think that the neighbor would say if the Potter arrived in the street. The Dursley knew that the Potter had a small son too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potter away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull, gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside that suggested that a strange or mysterious thing would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl fluttered past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls like little tyke, chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the houses. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of some peculiar, a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Private Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of light. Miss Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back as Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road. He watched the cat in the mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Private Drive. No, looking at the sign, cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. He drove toward town. He thought of nothing except a large order of grills he was hoping to get that day. But in the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloak. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dress in funny clothes. The gets-up you saw on the young people. He supposed this was done some stupid new fashion. He drummed his finger on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on the huddle of those widows standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see what a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him, but that struck Mrs. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in the running car park, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office. On the 9th floor, if he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see that the owls, swooping past in the broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl, even at night time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal, owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made severally important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he would stretch his leg and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery opposite. He would have forgotten all about the people in the cloak until he passed a group of them next to the baker. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This lot were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in a bag. Then he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Porters, that's right, that's what I heard. Yes, their son Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at them, the whisper, as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his most secretaries not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put a receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Porter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure that there were lots of people called Porter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in warning Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her. If he had had a sister like that, but all the same, those people in cloak. He found out a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile and said in a squeaky voice that made a passer-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who had gone at last. Even muggles like me, like yourself, should be celebrating this happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought that he had been called a muggle. Whatever that was, he rattled. He hurried to his car and set off home, hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was a tabby cat he'd spotted that morning too. It was sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same marking around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered, trying to pull himself together. He let himself into his house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problem with her daughter and how Dudley had learned a new word, shan't. Mr. Dudley tried to act normal. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since surprise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have been suddenly changed their most sleeping patterns. The newsreader allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious, and now over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's only the owls that have been acting oddly today. We were as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dunny have been phoning and to tell me that instead of rain, I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour shooting star. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting star all over Britain? Owls flying by daylight? Mysterious people in cloak and over those places? And a whisper? A whisper about the porters? Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He would have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia? Dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mrs. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting star, and there are a lot of funny-looking people in town today. So, snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her lot. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he had heard the name Porter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually as he said, their son, he had about Dudley age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry, nasty common name if you ask me. Oh, yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agreed. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley, heart sinking horribly, yes, I quite agreed. He didn't... Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Porters? If it got out what they were related to a pair of, well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursley got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the porter were involved, there's no reason for them to come near him. And Mrs. Dursley, the porter, knew very well that he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was! Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting all still as a statue, its eyes fixed blankly on the far corner of the private drive. It didn't so much as quiver when the car door slammed in the next street, not when the 2 owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared in the corner the cat had been watching, appeared so suddenly and silent you would have just thought he would just pop out of the ground. The cat tail twitch and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen in Private Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which was both long enough to tuck in his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak which swept the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright and sparkling behind half moon spectacle, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus and Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he did seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He had found what he was looking for inside his pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered into the darkness. 12 times he clicked the put-outer until the only lights left in the whole street were 2 tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back inside his cloak and set off down the street toward number 4, where he sat down the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but for a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses. Exactly the shape of the marking the cat had around its eyes. She, too, was wearing a cloak, an emerald-eyed one. Her black hair was drawn in a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "Don't be stiff, you've been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "Oh yes, everybody's celebrating, all right," she said impatiently. all day when you could have been celebrating. I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh yes, everybody's celebrating, all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd been a bit more careful. But no, even the Muggle have noticed something is going on. It was on their news." She jerked her head back on the Dursley dark living room window. "I heard it. Flocks of owls, shooting star. Well, they're not completely stupid. They're bent to notice something. Shooting star down in Kent. I'll bet that was Dudley's Diggle. He never had much sense." "You can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. "You've had precious little to celebrate for 11 years. "I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably. "But that's no reason to lose our head. People are being downright careless. Out on the street in broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes, swapping rumors." She threw a sharp sideway glance at Dumbledore here, as though hoping he was going to tell her something, but he didn't, so she went on. "A fine thing it would be if on the very day you know who seemed to have disappeared at last, the Muggle found out all about us." "Oh, I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore." "It certainly seems so," said Dumbledore. "We have much to be thankful for. What would you care for sherbet lemon?" "A what?" "A sherbet lemon. They're a kind of Muggle sweet I'm rather fond for." "No, thank you," said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think this was the moment for sherbet lemons. "As I say, even if you know who has gone." "My dear Professor, surely as a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you-know-who's nonsense. For 11 years I've been trying to persuade people to call him his proper name. Voldemort." Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore was unsticking 2 sherbet lemon, seemed not to notice. "It all got so confusing if we keep saying, you know who." I've never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name. I know you haven't, said Professor McGonagall, expanding, half exasperated, half admiring. But you're different. Everybody knows you're the only one you know who. You know. Oh, all right, Voldemort was frightened of. You flatter me, said Dumbledore calmly. Voldemort had power I'll never have. Only because you're too, well, noble to use them. It's lucky it's dark. I've blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuff. Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, the owls are nothing to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying about why he disappeared? About what finally stopped him? It seemed that Professor McGonagall had reached the point she was most anxious to discuss. The real reason she'd been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day, for neither as a cat nor as a woman, had she fixed Dumbledore with such a piercing stare as she did now, it was plain that whatever everybody was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another sherbet lemon and did not answer. What they're saying, she pressed on, is that last night Voldemort turned up in Godric Hollows. He went to find the Porters. The rumor is that Lily and Jane Porter are that they're dead. Dumbledore bowed his head. Professor McGonagall gasped. Lily and James. I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Albus. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as she went on. That's not all. They're saying he tried to kill the Porter's son, Harry. But he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. No one knows why or how. But they're saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke, and that's why he's gone. Dumbledore nodded glumly. It's true, flattered Professor McGonagall. After all he's done, all people he's killed, he couldn't kill a little boy. It's just astounding of all the things to stop him. But how in the name of heaven did Harry survive? We can only guess, said Dumbledore. We may never know. Professor McGonagall pulled out a lace handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff as he took a golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very odd watch. It had 12 hands but no numbers. Instead, little planets were moving around the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back into his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose it was he who told you I would be here, by the way. Yes, said Professor McGonagall, and I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here all places. I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family he has left now. You can't mean the people who live here? Cried Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing at the number 4. Dumbledore, you can't. I've been watching them all day. You can find 2 people who are less like us, and they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter came and lived here. It's the best place for him, said Dumbledore firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written them a letter. A letter? Repeated Professor McGonagall faintly, sitting back down to the wall. Really, Dumbledore? You think you can explain all this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend, and I won't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in future. There'll be books written about Harry. Every child in the world will know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking very seriously over the top of his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before he can walk and talk. Famous for something he won't even remember. Can't you see how much better off he'll be growing up away from all that until he's ready to take it? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth, changed her mind, swallowed, and then said, Yes, you're right, of course. But how is the boy getting here, Dumbledore? She eyed his cloak suddenly as though she thought he might be hiding Harry underneath it. Hagrid's bringing him. You'd think it wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right places, said Professor McGonagall grudgingly, but you can't pretend he's not careless. He does tend to. What was that? A low rumbling sound had broken the silence around them. It grew steadily louder. Both looked up at the sky, and a huge motorbike fell out of the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorbike was huge, it was nothing to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man, and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild. Long tail of bushy black hair and beard hid most of his faces. He had hands the size of Dustin Blitz, and his feet in their leather boots were like baby dolphin, and the vast muscular arms was holding a bundle of blankets. Hagrid, said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. At last, and where did you get that motorbike? The motorbike. Borrowed, Professor Dumbledore, sir, said the giant, climbing carefully up the motorbike as he spoke. Young Sirius Black lent it me. I've got him, sir. No problem, were they? No, sir. House was almost destroyed, but I got him out all right before the muggles started swarming around. He fell asleep as we was flying over Bristol. Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent over the bundled blanket, and such as visible was a baby boy fast asleep. Under full jet black hair over his forehead, they could see a curious shape cut, like a bolt of lightning. Is that where? Whispered Professor McGonagall. Yes, said Dumbledore. He'll have that scar forever. Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore? Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scar can come in useful. I've worn myself above my left knee, which is perfect map of the London Underground. Well, give him here, Hagrid. We'll better get this over with. Dumbledore took Harry in his arm and turned toward the Dursley houses. Could I say goodbye to him, sir? Asked Hagrid. He bent his great shaggy head over Harry and gave him what might have been a very scratchy, whiskery kiss. Then suddenly Hagrid let a howl like a wounded dog. Shush! hissed Professor McGonagall. No, wake the muggles! Sorry, sobbed Hagrid, taking a large spotted handkerchief and burying his face in it. But I can't stand it. Lily and James dead, and poor little Harry off to live with the muggles. Yes, it's all very sad, but we grab grip on yourself, Hagrid, or we'll be found, Professor McGonagall whispered, patting Hagrid gently on the arm as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden wall and walked down to the front door. He laid Harry gently on the doorstep, took a letter out of his cloak, tucked it inside Harry's blanket, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute, the 3 of them stood and looked in a little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked furiously, and the twinkling light that usually shone from Dumbledore's eyes seemed to have gone out. Well, said Dumbledore finally, that's that. We have no business staying here. We may as well go and join the celebration. Yeah, said Hagrid in a muffled voice. I'll best get this bike away. Good night, Professor McGonagall. Good night, Professor Dumbledore, sir. Wiping his streaming eyes on his jacket sleeve, Hagrid swung himself on the motorbike and kicked the engine into life. With a roar in the roast in the air of the night, I shall see you soon, I expect it, Professor McGonagall, said Dumbledore, nodding to her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked back down the street. On the corner, he stopped and took out the silver put-outer. He clicked it once, and 12 bulb lights sped back into their street lamp. So that private drive glowed suddenly orange, and he could make a tabby cat slinking around the corner on the other end of the street. He could just see the bundled blanket on the step of the number 4. Good luck, Harry, he murmured. He turned on his heel, and with a switch of his cloak, he was gone. A breeze ruffled the neat hedge of the private drive, which lay silent and tidy under the inky sky. The very last place you would expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside his blanket without a waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him, and he slept on, not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be woken up in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottle, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He couldn't know that at that very moment, people meeting in secret all over country were holding up their glasses and saying in a hushed voice, "To Harry Potter, the boy who lived."